Just over 4 months ago now, Ukraine finally pulled the trigger on its long-awaited southern counteroffensive. A number of Ukrainian brigades, many of which were newly created, pushed against the prepared Russian defences in Zaporizhia, and despite making some initial gains, discovered just how dangerous the combination of Russian minefields, artillery, drones and defensive fortifications could be. Without air superiority or many of the systems and munitions necessary to break those kind of defences in short order, the last several months have largely seen Ukraine fall back on more conservative, proven tactics, attempting to steadily attrit and grind their way into Russian defensive positions, as opposed to trying to break clean through them. The result has often been hard battles fought over individual trenches or tree lines, all while a critical artillery duel continues to play out, and more reserves are committed to join the fight. Now, with the fighting very much ongoing, but Ukraine's mud season and then winter rapidly approaching, I thought it was a good time to stop and take stock of the Ukrainian offensive so far, asking not just how it's progressed, but what we as observers have learned as a result, and what that might mean for Ukrainian and Russian hopes in the winter and into 2024. To do that, I'll give a brief refresher on what we believe the objectives of the Ukrainian offensive are, and where it was up to in June when we last spoke about it. Then we're going to have a more detailed look at the Russian defences along the so-called Surovikin line. We've learned a lot about those defence lines, fortifications and their supporting minefields as the offensive has played out, and I'd argue no understanding of this offensive is complete without understanding those obstacles. Then we'll look at how the campaign has played out on a number of major fronts, in the south, in the east and in the Black Sea, before zooming out to ask more what that fighting looks like. What sort of systems and tactics are being employed? To what extent do they seem to be working or not working? And building on that, we're going to try and make some observations and ultimately evaluations, trying to understand how much success each side is having and what that might mean for the war to come. But before I do so, please let me welcome back a returning sponsor. Ground News is a combination website and app that lets you compare articles from thousands of sources around the world in one place, showing you what sources are reporting where they lean on the political spectrum, and letting you compare headlines and read articles without ever leaving the app. And since big topics like the war in Ukraine are always going to be bigger than one story, Ground News lets you focus your comparison on specific topics. For example, you could choose to follow Russia and Ukraine to create a feed that only includes those two topics. But Ground News also allows you to take it a step further and get very, very specific. We all have limited time to consume the news, and so Ground News tries to give you fine control of your news feed. For example, if I wanted a feed which only included stories on either US politics or Ukraine, I could set up something like this, save it, and it would filter accordingly. If I only want stories that cover both topics at the same time, I can do that too. And if you feel you've seen enough coverage on a particular topic, you can add those here as specific exclusions. That will let you continually refine your feed. It won't remove the political diversity of the coverage, just focus it on topics that interest you. All up, this is a fascinating way to read the news and probably worth having a look at. If you are interested, there is a link in the description that'll give you 30% off an all-access Vantage subscription. Just go to ground.news/Perun or click the link to check it out. So with that said, let's get back to the video. And would it really be a Perun video if I didn't open with some notes on caveats and sources? So far as sources go, I'll be referring to a number in the presentation and they'll be below in the description. But I want to give a special note to a recent RUSI report, largely based on the findings of a research team that had gone to Ukraine to see what is happening for themselves. I also want to flag I won't be jumping too far into the question of casualties, losses and force regeneration in this episode. I feel those issues are both so important and so data intensive that they really deserve their own episode. So with that caveat and preview out of the way, let's get into it. Starting by going back to how this offensive began and what we believe it might have been attempting to achieve. Because war isn't a turn-based strategy game where each side waits patiently for the other to complete its attacking turn. Going on the offensive is a choice and a potentially expensive one. So there's room to ask what Ukraine might have been trying to accomplish by going on the attack. Now, a glib response to the objective question might be something like they were trying to win the war. But short of showing Prigozhin how it's done, dropping some paratroopers on Moscow and grabbing the entire Russian political leadership in one fell swoop, it would be kind of ambitious for any single offensive to have that as an objective. Instead, I think there's some broader objectives that we can probably impute, things like the political goal of demonstrating to the Ukrainian and foreign populations that Ukraine is capable of going on the offensive against the Russian army, as well as general military objectives like seizing the initiative and degrading Russian forces to weaken their capacity to launch further offensives in the future. But when you're talking about territorial objectives, that's something that would often be classified. If the UK was ever planning to take the whole Brexit thing to the next level, they'd probably want to keep it a secret, at least until the first Royal Marines started landing on the continent. But in Ukraine, the most obvious location for a counterattack always seemed to be the south, which is where we've seen most of the offensive effort play out now. And while I'd always avoid caution when dealing with official statements, The commander of the main Ukrainian group pushing in that direction, General Tarnovsky, has been pretty clear about the operation's territorial objectives which pretty closely align to the analysis we were doing here earlier in the year. In the dream scenario, Russian forces collapse and the Ukrainians are able to advance all the way to the Sea of Azov, breaking the Russian land bridge to Crimea. At that point, the destruction of the Kerch Strait Bridge would threaten the viability of all Russian forces in Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea. Meanwhile, a more conservative objective is just to get to Tokmak. That would effectively cut critical road and rail east-west connections. It wouldn't cut off Russian forces to the west the same way that making it all the way to the sea would, obviously. But it would make their life increasingly difficult while giving Ukraine potentially a great springboard for further offensive action. The Russian objectives, meanwhile, appear to be in direct opposition. They've invested enormously in multi-layered defences in Zaporizhia, including everyone's favourite concrete militarised traffic cones, the so-called Dragon's Teeth, with the apparent goal of keeping Ukrainian territorial gains to an absolute minimum, while preferably inflicting attrition. One suspects that the Russians were hoping that if this strategy was overwhelmingly successful, it might put them in the position to launch a new series of offensives of their own, either over the winter or in the early stages of 2024. Then, alongside the southern front in Zaporizhia, you have the question of Ukraine's eastern front. Here, we've seen secondary Ukrainian offensive actions around places like Bakhmut, but also numerous defensive actions against ongoing Russian attacks. Based on the fact that it appears Ukrainian units in this area don't receive the same priority for new equipment or ammunition supplies as those fighting in critical areas of the south, a cautious and tenuous interpretation of Ukraine's likely objectives in the region might be pinning down and attriting as many Russian forces as possible to limit their ability to redeploy and influence the main axis of advance, namely the push south in Zaporizhia. Finally, there appears to be another concurrent Ukrainian effort targeting the Black Sea, Crimea, and Russian rear areas. And again, we can make some reasoned guesses about potential objectives. There are, for example, political, military, and economic benefits from pushing back the Russian Black Sea fleet, degrading logistics and defences in Crimea and Zaporizhia, and perhaps increasing Ukraine's ability to move critical cargoes by ship without intervention by the Russian fleet. In the event that the logistical situation in Zaporizhia or Kherson began to deteriorate, you could argue the bridges, logistics, and port capacity of Crimea would be a critical support factor for the Russians. So placing pressure on Crimea and Russian rear areas is not only going to stretch Russian resources, but also serve other Ukrainian offensive, defensive, and political objectives. Meanwhile, some of Russia's objectives might be simply the inverse: to preserve the influence and access of the Black Sea fleet to the Ukrainian coast, to defend critical infrastructure and logistics nodes in Crimea, and to finally be able to answer the question of what air defense doing with more than a nervous shrug and a couple more explosions in the background. That may sound glib, but with the impending 2024 arrival of F-16, new families of drones, and additional long-range strike options for Ukraine, building the effectiveness of and confidence in Russia's air defense systems is likely something of an imperative. Now, when talking about Ukrainian offensive objectives and Russian defensive efforts, however, there is one major bit of context, one that has arguably shaped every step of how this offensive has played out, and about which we've learned more with every passing day. Namely Russia's extensive network of prepared defensive positions all across the Zaporizhia front. Russia prepared for the Ukrainian offensive by creating an immense system of multi-layered fixed defences. Now, historically, fixed defences and entrenchments have often suffered from an issue, namely that they don't do their job particularly well if the attacker can simply go around them. Just ask the French of 1940 how it felt when the Germans managed to hook some panzers around the Maginot Line. But with the Surovikin lines, the Russians came up with a high-tech solution to that age-old problem. Namely, they just extended it along the entire length of the front. At which point, you can't go over it, you can't go around it, so you have to go through it. Now, when it comes to public discussions of the Surovikin line and its defences, the terminology is often confusing. You'll hear references to things like the first line, the second line, the main line, the last line, and often different sources and commentators will be using those terms very differently. At a time when you had some Ukrainian sources talking about breaching into the second line of defences, you still had some, usually pro-Russian commentators, saying they hadn't even reached the first one. In part, that's because this thing is a complex, multi-layered series of defences, and there's a lot of debate over what exactly counts as a main line of defence. So to avoid the confusion, let me just say, generally speaking, what's there. Across much of the line, there's a forward defensive zone which may be many kilometres deep, and is usually going to be defended by minefields, trenches, fortified tree lines, and geographical features. Then you have the belts of serious, often machine-prepared defences that have been visible from space and you see identified on maps like this one. This is where you'll see things like concrete Toblerones and pillboxes, as well as anti-tank ditches and significant prepared defences. although again, things will vary greatly at different points along the line. And at many points along the front, there are going to be multiple layers of defences like that one. But the most impressive, as far as we can generally tell from satellite, tends to be the middle or main one. Now, maps like this one, based on painstaking image analysis work, are useful, but as the offensive has played out, something which is very painful for the Ukrainian offensive has become increasingly apparent. Namely, many of those gaps between prepared fortifications visible from space aren't in fact gaps, and instead they're often filled by fortified tree lines and concealed defensive positions. To give just one example, here's a series of 3 satellite images posted by a Ukrainian reserve officer. Many of you are probably familiar with his work and his new Front Intelligence Insight project. On the left, you can see what just appears to be a tree line in the middle of a green field. However, as the artillery rains down and all of that foliage and vegetation is blasted away, you can see what the trees are ultimately concealing. The act of ecological devastation reveals a number of trenches and prepared fighting positions. Concealed positions like these may already provide a barrier to attacking forces, and that's before you factor in elements like potential defensive minefields, deep dugouts, or in some cases, linking underground tunnels, so what seem like isolated Russian defensive positions, in fact represent part of a larger interconnected defensive system. If you're mapping defences based on satellite imagery, this might look like empty space. But if you're a unit tasked with assaulting through that particular location, well, you're going to discover pretty quickly just how not empty can be. And supporting those defences have often been Russian minefields, which are in turn often screened by minefields, surrounded by minefields, and which, in the event of an attempted Ukrainian breach, might be augmented by other artillery-deployed minefields. Minefields were a largely understood and expected threat going into the Ukrainian counteroffensive. They're something that both sides have previously had to deal with earlier in this conflict, but the scale of the fields that Ukraine has discovered and now has to fight its way through seem to be less like those minefields you might find in modern doctrinal documents, and instead bear more than a passing resemblance to a game of the floor is lava, but played along an entire front line. If you pull out the US Field Manual 20-32, Mine Countermine Operations, you'll find a table setting out what some standardised row minefields are meant to be depending on their purpose. A minefield that is merely intended to disrupt an enemy advance might be 250 metres wide and 100 metres deep. Into those 25,000 square metres, the manual says you should place approximately 126 anti-tank mines. If you want the most resource-intensive type of minefield, one that is intended to block enemy movements entirely, well, then you expand the frontage to 500 metres, the depth to 320 metres, and you plant a grand total of 546 anti-tank mines. If this minefield happens to be on the Korean Peninsula, then you also plant into that area 84 anti-personnel mines. These are added to help discourage dismounted breaching attempts, basically suggesting that while a force like Russia might have specialised mine-clearing equipment, the North Koreans are more likely to descend in the sappers on foot. I need to stress here that when we say a minefield is intended to block an opponent, that is, prevent them from moving through it, it's not meant to do that by itself. Block obstacles, as per FM 20-32, are meant to be supported by intense fires. And if an American officer in exercise conditions trusted an unsupervised minefield to completely block an enemy advance, well, I expect some of their colleagues would be wondering just how much damage they could do with a thrown copy of that 517-page tome. But the minefield is meant to be a significant obstacle, so let's think about those numbers again. Now, 630 mines, including those 84 anti-personnel charges, probably sounds like a lot of mines, and it is. But if you start looking at it in terms of mine density, the results might surprise you. There are 2 ways of thinking about density: how many mines there are per square metre or square foot within the minefield, and secondly, in terms of linear density, that is, if I pick a particular point of the minefield and walk through it, what are the odds I'll hit a mine? So let's pretend for a moment you're Private Conscriptovich and you need to advance through an FM 20-32 standard minefield. For the purpose of this exercise, we'll make it the most resource-intensive minefield, the blocking one. Assuming the mines are distributed evenly and there's never more than 1 mine per square metre, then if our infantryman selects a randomly selected square metre to stand in, he is, on average, going to be sharing that square metre with 0.004 landmines, making his odds of picking a square with a landmine in it 0.4%. Now, standing in one square isn't going to win a battle, so let's say he wants to advance across the minefield. If Conscriptovich picks a 1 metre section of the front and decides to walk the full 320 metres depth to the other side, then he will, on average, encounter 1.26 landmines, of which, in this example, 0.168 will be anti-personnel ones. So unless he's been eating well enough to qualify as an armoured vehicle, statistically speaking, he should be able to make it through. And assuming he's marking his path as he goes, it may, statistically speaking, be pretty safe for the rest of his infantry unit to follow up on his advance. Now, I'm aware that might make minefields sound like they're not particularly dangerous, and what's the point? And of course, that's entirely untrue because these are primarily anti-vehicle obstacles. A tank advancing on a 4-metre wide lane through that field in just the same way is going to encounter an average of about 5 mines. Even one would have decent chances of disabling the tank, and as you accumulate destroyed or disabled vehicles in the minefield, it might become harder and harder for other vehicles to manoeuvre and as a result avoid the mines. What you're seeing here is a figure from FM 20-32 showing the relationship between a minefield's linear density and the probability that a vehicle moving through that minefield will hit one of the mines. And as you can see, it doesn't take a huge linear density to start getting pretty significant probability figures. That means even minefields of this type pose a great danger to armoured vehicles. And anecdotally, some Ukrainian crews who trained in Germany say that these are the sort of minefields their instructors were marking on maps. Roughly 200-metre wide rectangles that would block part of their advance. The reporting claimed that they asked their instructors what they should do if they encountered such minefields. And the answer it's reported they were given is that they should drive around the minefield. Now, in the Ukrainian context, that sort of advice poses a couple of particular challenges. I mean, the problem of range and logistics obviously stands out immediately. A tank like the Leopard 2 is going to be able to go several hundred miles without refueling. But if you want to go around all the minefields, then you probably need an outflanking manoeuvre via Poland through Belarus and the Russian heartland, which is probably going to necessitate a heck of a logistical support train. And if you decide to try and go through the minefields rather than causing an international incident, you'll run into the problem that Russian minefields in Ukraine aren't NATO standard minefields. They're not even Russian standard minefields. The Russians reportedly began their invasion with a doctrinal assumption over how deep the standard minefield should be. That depth should be 120 metres, which, if you remember that table one slide earlier, is the same as the depth of an American fixing minefield in FM 20-32. However, experience in Ukraine seems to have convinced the Russians that in many cases that simply wasn't enough. 120 metres of depth meant, for example, that if you could bring up a UR-77 or a Western mine-clearing line charge right up to the minefield and launch the charge, then you hypothetically could, and in a number of cases Ukrainian forces reportedly did, blow a lane clean through the minefield. So just as the Russian adaptation to make evading a minefield harder was simply to make the minefields longer, the solution to making minefields harder to breach has been to make them deeper and denser. The Rusi report, for example, suggests that Russia has revised its practices, quote, from a doctrinal assumption of 120 metres to a practical aim to make them 500 metres deep, quote. And along that increase in depth was a change in both density and composition. If there is an explosive device invented by humans that can be buried in the dirt, there's a non-zero chance you'll find it in a Russian minefield in Ukraine. We've seen examples of Russia stacking multiple anti-tank mines on top of each other, for example, so that when a breaching vehicle with something like a mine plough comes through, the extra power of the explosion, because you're detonating multiple mines at once, is enough to disable or tear off the mine-clearing equipment. We've also seen delayed action and command-detonated explosives, which again pose an increased threat to breaching vehicles. Because if your mine roller activates a mine but it doesn't detonate until it's under the hull of the following vehicle, then the crew of that vehicle may be about to experience, to steal a phrase from the chieftain, a significant emotional event. Another phenomenon is the planting of anti-personnel mines around an anti-tank mine. The goal here being that when sappers come to clear the anti-tank mines to allow the vehicle's passage, they in turn find their work complicated by the presence of the anti-personnel mines. And even if a minefield is cleared or avoided, Russia has a number of artillery-deployed mine systems that let them essentially shoot minefields wherever they're required on the battlefield. And as for minefield density, that obviously varies greatly. But according to the Ukrainians, in the densest points of the Russian defence, Ukrainian troops are encountering 5 Russian landmines per square metre. That is more than 1,000 times the density of the blocking minefield we discussed from the American manual earlier. Moving through that American blocking minefield on a 1-metre frontage would see Private Conscriptovich encounter an average of 1.26 mines. A Ukrainian moving through a 500-metre deep Russian minefield with a density of 5 landmines per square metre would expect to encounter 2,500. Now obviously putting minefields of that depth and density everywhere would be incredibly resource intensive. Laying a 500-metre deep field, 5 mines per square metre along a 400-kilometre front would require 1 billion landmines. Now that is both a cartoonishly and implausibly large number that would put historical engagements like the Battle of Kursk or El Alamein to shame, but it also might suggest the usage of very small or potentially scatterable anti-personnel mines. because particularly if you are using more powerful mines, there's an upper limit as to how far you can dial up the density. Because if you plant the mines too close to each other, when one goes, there's a reasonable chance they all go. So you might get a situation where your stupidly overlaid explodium field takes one artillery hit, and then just cooking off in a wave of sympathetic detonations. So for various reasons, ultra-dense minefields are probably not going to be a universal constant. Extremely dense minefields, however, expect to see plenty of those. But of course, you don't need that depth and density everywhere to still create a massive breaching problem. And so the presence of those minefields imposes significant barriers on where and how Ukraine can practically attack. For example, launching a major attack without understanding the location, depth, and density of Russian minefields in the area could likely cause some combination of excessive casualties and operational failure. You could actually argue that Russia's seemingly chaotic approach to laying minefields might actually make the task of reconnaissance harder. If you encounter an opponent who's following the book exactly, well, when you encounter a minefield, you can assume, for example, that it might be 120 meters deep and contain so many mines of certain types. But when your opponent's strategy consists of burying anything that will explode in whatever quantity happens to be available, well, you can no longer make assumptions. But because mapping out minefields is difficult if you can't move up engineers and equipment, then realistically there may only be so far any attack can go before it outruns its intelligence on the local minefields. Similarly, actually clearing or breaking through those minefields requires specialised equipment that may not always be available in the quantities needed. Breaking through a 500 metre deep field, for example, would require at minimum 5 Mikliks, most of which, it should be noted, would have to be launched from within the former minefield itself, which means you better hope you have enough artillery to suppress enemy artillery and anti-tank guided missile crews, while your engineering vehicles work on the task of making the breach. And if you don't have enough equipment to make those sort of breaching strategies practical, then you have to fall back on older, more difficult alternatives, with forces in Ukraine often relying on dismounted sappers for minefield reconnaissance and clearing. This provides some overall context to the challenge created by these Russian systems of defences, and may go some way towards explaining why we've seen the campaign play out in the way we're about to talk through, especially when you recall that a lot of the Ukrainian units involved in this offensive were newly formed. As expected, the focus of Ukraine's counteroffensive has been in the south, so that's what we'll discuss first. Bear in mind though, because we covered some of this topic back in June, and because there are plenty of sources where you can get day-to-day updates on frontline movements, I'm going to try not to get lost in the detail here, instead focusing on the big picture. Back in June, Ukraine was attacking at several points along the line simultaneously. At the time, we described these as running from Vasilivka in the west, through other lines of advance near Orikhiv and Vilka Novosilka. As you can see on the map there, it was originally that eastern effort that took the most overall territory. Meanwhile, it was that Orikhiv push along one of the shortest roads to Tokmak that gave us some of those first widely publicised images of destroyed Leopard 2s and Bradleys in a field. As time has gone on, however, that appears to be the axis where the Ukrainians have focused a lot of their effort, and likely in part as a result of that, that's where we've seen some continued movements in the line over the last several months. While it may have been one of the toughest parts of the line, ultimately the nail that goes in is the one that gets the hammer applied to it. Despite some pretty extensive Russian defensive efforts, the village of Robotne was eventually taken. More recently, the Ukrainians have advanced east towards Verbove, and in so doing have started to break their way into the Surovikin line. The action over the last days and weeks have generally been slower, as Russian forces regularly counterattack to try and reclaim lost positions, while in turn the Ukrainians seem to be trying to widen their salient. Many media sources describe that act of breaching through the minefields and breaking into those Russian defence systems to be a major achievement. In general, you'd expect the value of a defensive line to be much diminished if your opponent manages to get behind it. And history gives us plenty of examples of armies realising that they don't have to bash their way through every metre of defensive frontage if they can just break through somewhere and then roll it up from there. One issue visible from this vantage point, however, is just how narrow this apparent salient is, which is why I want to sound something of a note of caution on how this battlefield achievement is being described. We live in the age of the 24-hour news cycle, so perhaps understandably, when we first started to get videos coming out of Ukrainian vehicles operating beyond that section of the Surovikin line, we saw some pretty heavy descriptions getting involved. You might have heard the Surovikin line being described as broken, or words like breach and breakthrough being used almost interchangeably. Now, of course, all these different terms might have different meanings in different militaries' doctrinal documents. But for what it's worth from a colloquial meaning standpoint, I wouldn't describe this as a breakthrough. For me at least, a breakthrough implies exploitation. It implies an ability to push something through the thing that you have just broken through. And that's not the position the Ukrainians currently find themselves in. Make no mistake, what was achieved was probably difficult, bloody, and significant. The Ukrainians have been able to move through some formidable minefields and occupy Russian defensive positions, wedging themselves in the defensive line. But there's been no sign that an exploitation force is about to push through and roll up the Russian line. Russian forces along most of the rest of the belt of defences have not been forced to pull back, and so I'd probably be tempted to call this a breach myself, not a breakthrough. With the fighting we're seeing now not being exploitation battles, but more hard positional ones. The fighting we're seeing in the south is still very much tree line to tree line, trench to trench, geographical feature to geographical feature. Those battles take place in the context of an ongoing fight for fire superiority, with artillery, aviation and drone assets all striking targets not just on the front line, but in the supply lines running towards them. The seizure of defensive positions does help shape the tactical battle in one sense. In a number of cases, the Russians are now stuck trying to dig Ukrainians out of defensive positions the Russians themselves prepared, making this perhaps the only time an army might wish its troops were sometimes worse at digging entrenchments. But overall, I think this is still a story very much in progress. And calling a breakthrough of this part of the Surovikin line now would be kind of like claiming a home run just because you put a runner on second. There's still very much a long, hard and uncertain way to go. Which brings us to the east and some of the major battlegrounds of 2022 and early 2023. Because depending on how you choose to define it, this front varies from being very long to extremely long. And along that line, as you might expect, you get plenty of variation. Around Bakhmut, it's generally been the Ukrainians on the offensive. Although from an analysis perspective, assessing both sides' objectives and commitment levels here has been difficult. The relevant Ukrainian general, Alexander Syrsky, has discussed a range of defensive objectives, but also at the same time put forward the goal of retaking Bakhmut, both to inflict damage on the Russian forces there and for the sake of reclaiming the city itself, which overall sounds like a very offensive interpretation of being on the defensive. Meanwhile, if you try and assess the significance that Ukraine attaches to the area, well, on one hand, some of Ukraine's best brigades are fighting in this area. On the other hand, they reportedly don't always receive the same priority on ammunition or equipment resupply as units in the south do. At the same time, we also see Russian sources describing significant fighting and resource commitments, and the cost of some of the actions in Donetsk. Russian state TV, for example, famed for never downplaying Russian casualties, recently aired an interview in which it was claimed that just one major Russian unit, the 150th Motor Rifle Division, was processing at least 100 to 150 wounded per day. As for changes in territorial control, they've been slow and arguably significant at a tactical level, but are much harder to see if you zoom out to the strategic. Hard battles were fought over the villages of Klishivka and Andriivka, both of which have fallen as at time of recording, and are now once again in Ukrainian hands. And it's now an open question as to whether or not Ukraine will be able to further expand its control either to the north or the south of the city. And if you happen to be looking at this map thinking that some of these village names look terribly familiar, they are, because many of these villages are ones we were describing Wagner seizing metre by metre back in late 2022. That's just the nature of the fight for places like Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and Marinka. In talking about the wider east, however, I want to bring up something that I'm concerned often gets lost in the coverage. Wars are often dominated by simple narratives, and the narrative at the moment is that Ukraine is the one on the offensive. At a strategic level, that's probably a very fair statement, and Ukraine holds the initiative. But in order to make that offensive possible, Ukraine has had to prioritise resources away from other parts of the line. We've often seen newer, perhaps less well-equipped brigades being pushed into defensive duty, and the Russian army has kept up a pretty frequent drumbeat of its own offensive operations at various points along the line. Some in areas of key interest, like Zaporizhia, but also Donetsk, Luhansk, even Kharkiv. These Russian attacks are frequent and ongoing. Just over a single one-week period, one observer noted Russian attacks at no less than 11 locations that you see on the screen there. These attacks and counterattacks go some way towards explaining why we see the attrition picture we see in the visually confirmed loss data, something I'll explore again in the future. If it was just the Ukrainians constantly on the offensive trying to grind through minefields against a passive Russian defender, you wouldn't expect visually confirmed loss data to still skew pretty heavily in Ukraine's favour. And indeed, in the areas of the counteroffensive, it doesn't. But again, a lot of the apparent ongoing loss asymmetry in heavy equipment doesn't necessarily relate to Ukrainian assault actions, but rather deep strikes behind the lines, and the Russian military's own pattern of continuing attacks and counterattacks. Which brings us to one of the critical dimensions of the fighting on the ground, namely just how many resources both sides have been pouring into it. Because I'd argue if you're trying to assess this offensive, it's not enough to just look at lines on a map, because in an attritional conflict, and make no mistake, this is a very attritional conflict, resource commitment and expenditure can be a vital factor. In part, that's because it might help us project future breaking points, and with those breaking points, potential outcomes. Over a short distance, I might be able to keep pace with or even get ahead of a long-distance Olympic runner. But if I'm sprinting in order to do so and only have a couple of minutes left before I collapse to the ground, while they could go for hours, it'd be a bit strange to describe it as an even race. The Ukrainian advance along the Orikhiv axis is probably a good example of why measuring commitment matters. The initial attacks there were led mostly by very new Ukrainian brigades with not much in the way of combat experience, and so there was a period there where progress slowed considerably. At that stage, the Ukrainians presumably faced a decision point. They could allow the attacks there to culminate, or they could commit additional resources and try and push on. They seem to have chosen the latter option, because some of the units that many observers expected would be used for an exploitation phase after the lines had been broken, were instead brought in to help with the initial breach of the Surovikin line. One example we have pretty good evidence of is the use of the 82nd Air Assault Brigade. Note that that is 100% the Ukrainian 82nd Air Assault Brigade, not the American 82nd Airborne. Trust me, if they had been committed to the counteroffensive, I would be making a very different video. So why am I talking about this particular Ukrainian formation? They appear to originally have been held in reserve before being committed to the attack probably sometime in August. The reason I'm talking about the 82nd is because we can be pretty confident that that was them. They're one of the units that operate some of the more distinct and rarer Western equipment in the Ukrainian arsenal, specifically the Challenger 2 main battle tanks from the UK. When we got video of a burnt-out Challenger 2 near Robotne, that was pretty good evidence that the 82nd was involved. It was also, I should note, the first example I'm aware of a Challenger 2 being destroyed as a result of enemy action. From an analysis perspective, I think the commitment of the 82nd sent mixed signals. On one hand, it was correlated with the attack speeding up again and Robotne falling. It established the advance probably could continue as long as sufficient resources were applied. But at the same time, it seemed to indicate just how hard Ukraine was having to push to make gains in the first place. Kind of like a coach using up more of the bench than originally planned during the first half. It might help get a critical advantage in the short run, but your team's going to have to dig that much deeper in the second half. I think this may be why we saw a number of pro-Russian sources focus very heavily on Ukraine's decision to commit these apparent reserves. Ukraine, they argued, was basically just coming out of the starting gates and yet committing its reserves, and clearly that was a sign that the offensive was in deep, deep trouble, which as an argument would potentially be very convincing if it wasn't for what was happening on the Russian side, because Russia likewise was committing a lot harder and a lot earlier than many observers had anticipated. In some ways, the Russian defensive setup in Zaporizhia can be described as a defense in depth. That's true in the sense that the belts of defenses run many kilometers deep. If an offensive can penetrate 10 kilometers into enemy defensive positions and only then be starting to hit the spot, it's kind of hard to call that shallow. But I think in the public mind the term defense in depth is usually associated with the sort of elastic defense, where you absorb the blow of the opponent, mainly only lightly garrison your forward positions, allow them to advance and then counterattack and drive them back, exhausting them with the depth of your defensive positions. That would be akin to something like German defensive tactics on the Western Front during the First World War. And as American analyst Michael Kofman noted, that may well have been what Surovikin had in mind when he conceived these defensive systems. But General Surovikin isn't in charge of Russian forces, General Gerasimov is. And under Gerasimov, commanders have demonstrated tremendous reluctance to let the Ukrainians take any territory. And so we've seen Russia commit significant forces not just to the defensive belts of the Surovikin line, but indeed in front of them. As Kofman put it, quote, Russian forces have chosen to defend forward of the Surovikin line, concentrating their efforts on holding the first line of defense and the towns that anchor it, end quote. So essentially, the Russians built an extensive system of hardened defenses, and then decided to fight as much of the battle as possible in front of them. Now, there are good reasons that you would want to fight in that security zone, but trying to fight as much of the action as possible in an attritional battle in front of your prepared defenses isn't really a full Battle of Winterfell maneuver, but it does seem to preference holding territory over controlling attrition. Of course, the point here isn't just about numbers, it's also about troop quality. In the Russian and Ukrainian forces, there can be immense qualitative differences between and even within units. You might have some units that are really only good for rear area security and might shatter if any significant pressure is applied to them, units that are capable of defending but not really going on the attack, and then those rare forces that are capable of carrying out offensive actions and actually trying to move the lines forward. That diversity can exist even within individual brigades and regiments. A Russian motor rifle regiment might, for example, have some Storm Z units attached to it to provide some, for lack of a better term, expendable infantry, because as horrifying as that concept is, it does seem to be one of the Wagner innovations that appears to have taken root in the Russian army. It might borrow some reconnaissance elements from other forces, and of course a Chechen Akhmat battalion to make sure the regiment has a great social media presence. So if we're looking for clues as to Russian commitment and stress levels around the Ukrainian counteroffensive, I'd suggest it helps to look at what sort of units we are seeing them bring forward. By reputation, Russia's best forces are its airborne and marine infantry units. That's a pretty common phenomenon around the world, to the point where you might think that giving a troop jump wings is good for a decent stamina and HP boost. Russia's pre-war airborne forces included 2 air assault divisions, 2 airborne divisions, and a number of airborne brigades. On paper, they're meant to serve certain core military functions, acting as a strategic reserve, a spearhead during major operations, and as a quick reaction force. And of those airborne forces, by reputation at least, the 76th Guards Air Assault Division are probably some of the best of the best. 7th Guards Mountain Air Assault Division are also a top-tier formation. So if Russia was planning major offensive operations for the winter, or wanted a reserve capable of responding to a crisis if one was to develop, you'd expect that to be a job for a unit like the 76th. So where have these units been, you might ask? And the answer is not preparing for some new offensive. Units of the 76th appear to have been pulled out of reserve and positions around the Svardova-Kreminna line, and now find themselves holding trenches and leading counterattacks against the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Zaporizhia. Units from the 7th find themselves in a similar position, committed to battles in Zaporizhia. It's some of the best Russia has fed into the line. As well as the best, we've also seen Russia feed in the arguably unready. 25th CAA was a new unit that Russia was raising. As late as August, Russia was reportedly releasing recruitment advertisements, calling for new volunteers and saying, don't worry, the army won't be deploying until December. And so of course we started getting reporting around 13th September that units from 25th CAA were being committed in Ukraine. For men who signed up in late August on the promise that they'd be getting at least 3 months of solid training, as opposed to a ticket to Ukraine, I suppose that might have counted as the sudden and inevitable betrayal stage. But jokes aside, it does seem to indicate that Russia has been willing to pull not just from its elite reserve troops, but also to rush other units through their generation and training process just to get more troops into Ukraine now. That obviously helps bolster the line and pays immediate military dividends. But it also highlights a potential answer to another recurring question. I've often seen it asked, what is the strongest line of Russian defence? And an answer I've seen given, which I think bears repeating, is whatever line they choose to man. All the trenches and minefields in the world don't matter at all if they're not held by infantry and covered by artillery. And so we'd expect Russian forward defences to be very strong, because they push so much of their proverbial force forward. It means that some of those forward positions are going to have much better manning levels per area of frontage than they did during things like the Kharkiv offensive, for example. I've attached a report estimating that at one point the 291st Guards Motor Rifle Regiment was holding roughly an 11-kilometre front, which, with all of its attached additional units, meant that it could have 2 echelons of defence, a reserve, and also to rotate its units. As a strategy, it's got potential returns, but it's also risky. It's kind of like turning up to a poker game, sitting down and then going all in on your first hand. Very much go big or go home. You maximise your chance of holding the Ukrainian offensive pretty close to its starting positions. But if your force wears down before the opposing force does, fighting heavy battles in those positions, then you might struggle to man and defend positions further back or sustain your own offensive operations in the future. Whether this decision actually pays off is probably something that won't be apparent until well into next year, if it ever is. Although for Ukrainian troops having to fight their way through well-manned positions defended by some of the best Russia has to offer, I imagine that may be something of a cold comfort. Finally, while all that is going on, there's also the Ukrainian campaign in the Black Sea, Crimea, and the deep rear of Kherson and Zaporizhia. And here I'd assess the developments as far less ambiguous. Given its near-complete lack of a navy and very limited relevant resources, Ukraine has basically been running the Wish.com version of an anti-access area denial campaign, trying essentially to zone Russian and Russia ships further and further away from the Ukrainian coast. And yet, over the last couple of months, it seems to be working. Drone attacks and missile threats have made it increasingly dangerous for Russian ships to operate within range of the Ukrainian coastline, and in September, Ukraine took back a number of drilling rigs in the Black Sea from Russian control. That robbed Russia of locations it could potentially sight anti-aircraft missiles, radars, or other sensors, and instead put those positions in Ukrainian hands. The program of long-range strikes against targets in Crimea has continued, with Ukraine using a variety of tools ranging from disposable one-way kamikaze drones to adapted S-200 anti-aircraft missiles, through to special forces raids and anti-ship missile strikes to target things like Russian air defense installations. Then, where gaps or weaknesses in air defense seem to be identified or suspected, we've seen follow-up strikes using Western air-launched cruise missiles, things like Storm Shadow and Scalp. Recent examples of these sort of capstone targets being hit include the attack on the submarine Rostov-on-Don in dry dock, the supply ship Minsk, also in dry dock, and of course the recent renovation of Russia's Black Sea Fleet HQ. Now, unsurprisingly, assessing the impact of these strikes using Russian press releases is sometimes difficult. We will occasionally see, for example, claims of all missiles being shot down despite very obvious impacts, or the somewhat questionable claim that the double missile strike on the Black Sea Fleet headquarters caused only one military casualty. It's amazing how often in this war sides seem to claim that falling drone or missile debris hits with the impact of dozens or hundreds of kilos of high explosive. But what is apparent from the imagery is that Russia appears to be moving more and more of its naval assets away from Sevastopol. The submarines and many of the larger ships, for example, were spotted relocating to Novorossiysk. It's obviously far from the end of Russian ability to project power into the Black Sea. They can still send submarines and ships out on sorties, and they can still fly naval aviation from Crimea, but the recent trend does seem to have been pretty clearly in Ukraine's favour. And all of this is taking place against the backdrop of two important pieces of context. The first being the collapse of the grain deal and Ukraine's desire to re-establish some ability to access global maritime trade. Grain exports are economically important for Ukraine and have been politically sensitive with some of Ukraine's allies in the West. The more of those cargoes that Ukraine is able to ship by the Black Sea, either via Romania or through its own ports, the more likely it is that those sort of tensions with countries like Poland will be able to be managed. The other piece of context, of course, is the vital role of Crimea's infrastructure in supporting Russian forces there and in Kherson and Zaporizhia. If the capacity of those logistical links through Tokmak or the land bridge were ever seriously constrained, well, that would put a much greater premium on the ability of the Russians to bring in supplies by sea or across the Kerch Strait Bridge. That's obviously not the situation right now, and Russia is pushing to repair the Kerch Strait Bridge as quickly as possible. But given this war seems to still be very far from over, there are probably some serious military and political imperatives for Ukraine to keep up the pressure on Crimea in the near future. That's especially true if Ukraine receives new supplies of long-range weapons, things like ATACMS, Taurus, or new cruise missiles, because it's those, along with Storm Shadow, Scalp, Neptune, and similar, that allow them to hold many of these valuable rear-area targets at risk. So that's the way the campaign has played out in terms of the resources committed and how the lines have moved. But what I want to talk about now is instead what the fighting along those fronts actually looks like. Because while we did see some large, high-profile attempted mechanized advances by Ukrainian forces in the earliest days of the offensive, that's not really how most Ukrainian attacks are now being prosecuted. Instead, most Ukrainian attacks are now carried out by relatively small units, usually of dismounted infantry. We're not talking about some mechanized Ura charge by corps, divisions, or brigades, but instead small, carefully planned and sequenced assaults by assault companies, platoons, or even smaller units. The Rusi report includes the example of 2 tanks leading a force made up of infantry and MRAPs. And we have plenty of video evidence of small units of infantry operating in cooperation with usually 1 or 2 tanks or armoured vehicles. It's a mode of fighting where the skill and motivation of the individuals involved can make a genuine difference. The Rusi report gives an example from the assault on Novodarivka. There, a number of Ukrainian infantry mounted in MRAPs found their vehicles either being knocked out by long-range Russian tank fire or bogged down in the middle of a minefield. Some of the Ukrainian infantry quite understandably pulled back, but others, apparently looking at their situation stranded under fire in the middle of a minefield, decided the only logical action was to continue the advance on foot. They made their way to the outskirts of the village where they held until the Russian tanks could be knocked out and the force relieved. Assaults like the one at Novodarivka, which were covered in the Rusi report, generally included examples of things going wrong. Vehicles bogging down or deviating from course in minefields and being knocked out by mines. Russian tanks emerging from ambushing positions and firing on columns at exactly the worst possible moment. But when you're talking about assault operations like that at the small unit level, it's pretty clear there might be a premium on troop skill and motivation that might not be present in other modes of fighting. Observation 2 is that it's your ability to deliver fires that enables offensive operation. If you want to move forward, winning the artillery battle isn't just useful or important, it's arguably obligatory. As the Rusi report puts it, quote, "The prerequisite condition for any offensive action is fire's dominance," end quote. Throughout 2022, Russia had a crushing advantage in weight of available fires, and Russian forces do seem to have a continuing advantage over Ukraine in number of artillery tubes, available ammunition, and of course, aviation assets. But the available evidence suggests that Ukraine has been able to win fire superiority locally on parts of the front to enable this counteroffensive. It's done so by leveraging the greater range and precision of many of the Western systems provided, exploiting the power of newly arrived DPICM cluster munitions, which are continuously complained about in Russian sources, and engaging in a vicious, ongoing, and apparently very successful campaign against the Russian artillery. Now, loss rates are obviously very bumpy, and I've talked about the limitations of visually confirmed loss data before, but the ratio for visually confirmed artillery losses over the course of September was 5-1 in favour of Ukraine, and a significant share of those Ukrainian losses were older Soviet-era systems that don't have the same range and precision of many of their Western counterparts. HIMARS and its Gimlis rockets, once a predator that fed almost exclusively on Russian ammunition depots, has now broadened its diet to reflect a new role as a counter-battery system, precisely engaging Russian artillery systems. And because of the range of Gimlis, even comparatively long-range Russian guns can be brought into range. Good example here are Russia's literal big guns, the 203mm self-propelled gun 2S7. Of all Russian 2S7s lost since February 2022, more than 60% have been destroyed since June 1st, 2023. Ukraine obviously doesn't outgun Russia, and the Russians are continuing to change the way they use their artillery in order to reflect the new realities and constraints they're operating under. But the data we're getting and the fact the Ukrainians are able to hold the initiative points to the value and impact of a consistent supply of Western artillery and the associated ammunition, as does the growing family of Russian Home Depot artillery projects that we've been seeing appearing. The most recent ones, notably, have included MTLBs mounting naval weapons, things like anti-submarine rocket launchers with a secondary ground attack function. Now, I'm not saying those systems don't have utility. If you've got a bunch of rounds for your naval systems sitting around and they're not going to use them, why not bolt them to an MTLB and try and use them on a Ukrainian trench system? But you probably wouldn't be issuing these if you had an infinite supply of modern MLRS systems and the ammunition to go with them. But let's quickly pivot back to the question of why Ukraine might be relying primarily on small assault units. It's a relevant question because we have seen some criticism by anonymous Western officials in the media who suggest that Ukraine should be concentrating more force in order to move quicker. Now, obviously, it's pretty hard peeking through the fog of war to try and understand Ukrainian decision-making, but based on what we have seen and the evidence we have at hand, I'd suggest there are 3 relevant words: concentration, command, and casualties. The concentration point is one that we've discussed before. This is a transparent battlefield, there are drones everywhere, and the moment you start trying to bring together large collections of vehicles or manpower, the odds of spotting go up, and the imperative on your opponent to hit you with whatever weapon system they might have available also goes up. So unless you are absolutely confident that enemy drones are suppressed, their artillery is silenced, and they don't have any aviation assets available to hit you with things like glide bombs or rocket attacks, then it's just much less risky to not concentrate at scale. The command problem is more just a noted Ukrainian limitation. This is a mobilized army that's still recovering from many years of chronic underinvestment in the post-Soviet era. And while you might be able to train a rifleman in how to hold a trench relatively quickly, competent staff officers have a somewhat more extensive curriculum. And so for that and a variety of other reasons, Ukrainian units often find it difficult to coordinate larger scale operations. A brigade HQ might have the capacity to command a handful of companies at the contact line effectively, but the officers, the experience, the communication equipment, and the training might not always be there to coordinate something more complex. Think of planning these assaults as a particularly complex form of choreography. Although here, if you get it wrong, the result isn't a middling audience review or 2 dancers smacking into each other, it's potential friendly fire incidents, failed assaults, and letters to grieving families. And it also pays to remember that a lot of the units Ukraine committed to this offensive are newly formed. This offensive has often been their first real taste of combat as a unit, and that first experience has been trying to attempt one of the most difficult maneuvers a military can attempt: breaching actions, targeting well-prepared defences without air superiority. Doing that at scale is going to require expertise and equipment that may not always be there. So while that experience and equipment is accumulated, the Ukrainians fight the way they know. And then of course there's the point around casualties. The counteroffensive has been very expensive in terms of Ukrainian lives and wounded. We'll talk about this more in the future, but unsurprisingly, the data suggests that switching over to the offensive has been correlated with an increase in the rate of Ukrainian personnel losses. But by using small unit attacks that can be carefully planned and properly sequenced, the Ukrainians are probably adopting one of the least casualty-intensive options that is realistically available to them. You might argue these tactics are sort of reminiscent of the bite and hold tactics we saw in World War I, where instead of trying to throw a force at a line to break through it and then exploit, You take small chunks out of it, bit by bit, in carefully planned operations. Essentially, the mass attacks earlier in the war had generated significant casualties. Often what the German elastic defence would do was wait for an Allied offensive to move forward, overextend its logistics and artillery, if not always in range, then often just in sequencing and control, and then a powerful German counterattack would inflict disproportionate casualties and reclaim the lost positions. A bite and hold approach, by contrast, sought to put the Germans in a difficult position by seizing some of those less defended forward positions in a carefully planned and executed attack, and then, instead of carrying on and overextending, just digging in, resetting, and preparing to repeat the process. Meaning the Germans could either commit their counterattack against a foe that was now very well prepared to receive it, or just accept the loss and wait for the next nibble, as the line was steadily undermined, worn down, attrited, and corroded. Australian commander General Sir John Monash was probably one of the tactic's greatest practitioners, and you'll often see the Battle of Hamel raised up as a sort of exemplar of this kind of orchestrated battle. By World War I standards, the attack was relatively small, but it famously ended up taking its targeted objectives in 93 minutes, 3 minutes longer than the 90 minutes Monash had calculated it should take. And even though this was a World War I era attack into prepared defensive positions, it was the defenders who suffered greater casualty than the attackers, roughly at a ratio of 1.8 to 1. Now, there's sometimes a tendency by those who study history to overstretch historical comparisons. 1918 is a long way from 2023. Sir John Monash did not have an army of drones hovering over enemy positions, allowing him to monitor attacks in real time, although I imagine he would have been thrilled to have them. But my point is that historically, speed has sometimes come with trade-offs, and that by adopting a slow and steady approach, Ukraine might be putting itself in the best possible position to gain an advantage in the kind of hard attritional fighting that's defined so much about this war. The Ukrainians, much like the Russians, try to augment their frontline efforts with ongoing strikes against opposing logistics and into the deep rear. Lancet, Gimlers, and drone strikes are very common occurrences on both sides. But attacks on opposing logistics are only going to have their maximal effect if the demand for throughput is high, and the constant artillery dueling and fighting at the front serves to generate demand for that exact throughput. But make no mistake, the fighting we're now seeing is an absolute slog. Moving forward, position by position, and resetting every time you're successful might be a way to reduce casualties. But it also means your opponent is going to have time to reset their defense and prepare the next position. Meaning these assaults are going to have to continue until either one side is so corroded by attrition that they can't continue anymore and something breaks, or the attacking force manages to claw its way through the defences in front of it and breaks through to a location where the ground is not 10% landmine. So where does that leave us evaluating the Ukrainian counteroffensive after more than 4 months of offensive operation? In the Black Sea and Crimea, Ukraine has won a number of high-profile victories, especially when compared to the resources committed. Russia has lost valuable ships, installations, air defence systems, while also steadily seeing its sea lane control in the Black Sea undermined by an opponent whose primary naval combat assets include weaponised jet skis and naval drones named after internet memes, most of which cost significantly less per unit than your average naval torpedo. The fighting there obviously still has a long way to go, but I imagine there are a lot of navies around the world that are very closely watching to see how Ukraine's largely asymmetric effort in the Black Sea ultimately evolves and plays out. On the ground, however, things have been much harder, and the results much more mixed. By the Ukrainians' own admission, the counteroffensive has not moved as fast as they would have liked it to, and in the south, the stated objective of Tokmak is still some way away. The dreams of a rapid mechanised advance towards the Azov Sea now seem a very, very long way away. And instead, Ukraine has reverted to something more like the Kherson playbook, trying to wear down Russian forces, overstretch supporting logistics, and also now leveraging Western-supplied long-range, precision, and cluster munitions to try and erode the Russian advantage in artillery firepower that they have so heavily relied on through much of this war. But that doesn't take away from the apparent reality that this counteroffensive has been costly, and its execution full of compromises. Ukraine's allies ultimately pledged less weapons, equipment, and ammunition ahead of the counteroffensive than Ukraine said it needed. And then of those systems and munitions that were pledged, only a fraction actually arrived in time to participate. Equipment shortfalls, as well as some recognisable mistakes, particularly in the earliest days of the counteroffensive operation, have helped shape the scenario that we now see, with Ukrainian forces being strong enough to slowly grind forward, but not strong or well equipped enough to gain a decisive advantage and secure a decisive breakthrough. Russian defensive tactics, meanwhile, have evolved, and Russian units have generally proven themselves to be relatively capable on the defensive. They've adapted their unit structures, changed the way they use and leverage artillery to reflect the fact they no longer have the ability to put as many rounds on target as they did in the early stages of the invasion. There's more focus on responsive and effective fires, better integration of guided ammunition like Krasnopol, and the use of Lancet loitering munitions. Plus, there have been often effective efforts to narrow Ukraine's early war advantage in the availability and usage of drones at a tactical level, and Russian engineers have often proven to be masterful in advanced defensive techniques, like digging really deep holes for your troops to hide in, and then burying so many mines in front of your defensive positions that you are literally in some cases planting mines on top of other mines. It sounds simple, but for the Ukrainians who have to push through those minefields, often with inadequate clearing equipment, it's still going to be a hard, dangerous experience. That said, I still think it's pretty important to zoom out and take a pretty sober look about what the counteroffensive says about the two matched armies, and specifically how their capabilities, command of the initiative, and the terrain has changed over time. We're talking, of course, about the Orikhiv access now in the context of Ukrainian offensive, but we were also talking about it in January. Only then, it wasn't in the context of a Ukrainian offensive, but rather a Russian one. And in terms of territorial control, the Russian high watermark remains March 2022. The counteroffensive has not gone as the Ukrainians would have hoped, but even though territorial changes are now very slow, I don't think that's best characterized as either a stalemate or a reversal of the momentum. For now, Ukraine retains the initiative and has broken into some significant Russian defensive positions. The real question, I think, is which side can sustain this sort of level of effort more effectively and for longer. And while we will try and do it in future, that's one of the hardest things to assess from afar. Because while we can see what territory changes hands on a map, it's much harder to know the true condition of the forces on both sides. We might be able to identify when, for example, Russia throws in elite reserve units like the 76th. But factors like morale, manning levels, or ammunition and equipment availability are all harder to assess from afar. Mud season and winter are likely to slow offensive actions, but they're probably not going to stop the sort of short-range dismounted infantry assaults we've been seeing, nor the constant exchange of fires. So you can bet I'll be watching for any clues as to how well both sides are handling the attrition and regenerating from the losses suffered. Is Ukraine receiving enough equipment and, critically, enough missiles and artillery ammunition? How well are Russian logistics, munition and manning levels holding up? And will some of those elite units we've seen pushed forward to contain Ukrainian advances at some point be able to reconstitute and regenerate themselves well enough that they can effectively return to either a reserve or a potential offensive role for the Russians in the future? In terms of what comes next, a lot is probably highly contingent, but assuming there are no sudden unexpected developments, clearly a very safe assumption to make in the middle of a war, what do we think we might see in the coming months? In the nearest term, the answer is probably more of the same. Continuing Ukrainian operations to try and corrode their way through Russian defences, while the Russian military commits heavily to try and limit Ukrainian territorial gains, and perhaps find points of Ukrainian weakness elsewhere along the line. A lot of those actions are likely to be guided by a desire to inflict attrition on the opponent and minimise the attrition suffered in turn. And for observers and analysts trying to understand how the fighting is affecting the two forces is going to be critical. Ukraine and Russia, in a way, are both expending offensive capabilities, Ukraine by using its offensive-capable units to launch offensives, and Russia by using valuable professional troops that can probably be trusted with offensive actions, like the airborne, to instead fight defensive or counter-attacking actions against the Ukrainian offensive. Another interesting aspect of this is what does the fighting do to many of the green units that were engaged in it? For many Ukrainian and also some Russian units, the fighting in this offensive will be the first serious combat many of the troops involved have faced. They and their officers are going to be suffering and learning the hard way, and it remains to be seen whether these units will learn and become more combat capable over time, or whether attrition and exhaustion will degrade them faster than experience uplifts them. Either way, Ukraine and those troops will likely continue to face very serious obstacles. Not just because Russia is likely to continue its approach of sowing the fields of Ukraine not with the traditional salt, but rather with pressure-detonated high explosives, but also because there's probably a political element here that, while hard to assess, probably can't be ignored. One way or another, it certainly seems like the expectations placed on the Ukrainian military have dramatically changed over the last 18 or so months. In the first days of the February 2022 invasion, simply inflicting losses and delaying the Russian advance towards the Ukrainian capital was generally being reported in many places around the world as a tremendous achievement, a great act of valour by the Ukrainian military. As 2022 continued, the standard of success moved with it. Ukraine successfully defending its capital from Russia became the line for success, then successfully defending the cities of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, By now, however, it's clear that for many politicians and commentators, expectations have essentially reversed. Ukraine is expected to be on the offensive against the Russian army in the field. They are expected to be able to break through the most significant prepared defences Europe has seen since the Second World War, and to do it both in a timely fashion, and without either air superiority or even ground material superiority over their opponent. These questions of expectations are ultimately subjective. I'm very happy to leave them to the audience, and they don't affect the fundamental military challenges involved. But politically speaking, they absolutely might have an impact. Because as this offensive has shown, there's a direct correlation between the aid Ukraine receives from its partners and how effectively it's able to fight on the battlefield. A decision was made to supply HIMARS and the Gimlos rockets, and as a result, Ukraine is able to launch counter-battery strikes against very dangerous Russian artillery positions. Other systems either haven't been improved at all or were only approved relatively recently, meaning that Ukraine has had to fight without them. One thing the counteroffensive has probably done is provide outside observers with more data, more evidence as to what sort of material aid would be necessary to allow Ukraine to carry on this struggle successfully. The old optimism that the Russian army is just going to collapse or give up and go home has probably been banished. But at the same time, I'd argue that the effectiveness of a lot of military aid continues to be validated. So a key question now is whether Ukraine's allies will look at this offensive and decide to supply the equipment that the evidence suggests needs to be supplied, and if they do make that decision, then when? Because one way or another, it's now very clear that this war is likely to continue. Neither side is likely to reach their minimum territorial objectives without significant additional offensives. And Sergei Shoigu recently openly talked about the need to continue the war until at least 2025. The Ukrainian counteroffensive still likely has significant time left to run, and in all likelihood, so too, unfortunately, does this war. In conclusion, the Ukrainian offensive is now a little over 4 months old. In that time, we've seen a number of small but significant tactical gains made, including a breach into the Surovikin line. That was achieved through a change in Ukrainian tactics and a renewed focus on attriting Russian defenders. While Russia's defense in turn has been enabled by tactical adaptation, the commitment of valuable units, and the use of landmines and fixed defences on a truly massive scale. There's still a possibility that Ukrainian tactical gains will be converted into something more strategically significant, but whether that happens is still very much in the air and likely to depend on factors like the balance of relative attrition, the regenerative potential of both forces, and all the myriad decisions and forces of war. In the end, as is often the case, only time will tell. Which leaves me with a channel update to close out. I've been waiting to do a video on this topic for some time, and with the situation becoming clearer, more sources becoming available, and the month clicking over to October, I thought now was finally the time. I did think for some time about potentially combining this video with a number of other potential topics, including the status of things like attrition and force regeneration for both Ukraine and Russia. But in the end, I decided the topics would probably be better covered separately, so expect to see that one coming out sometime in the future. In relation to that though, I do have what might be considered something of a strange request. I try not to get into the business of myth-busting too much, but I also try to be as inclusive as possible with my considered sources. I go through and evaluate a lot of official Russian materials, for example, with the obvious caveat around their reliability. I'm also aware that questions around casualties and force generation are very bitterly contested in the information space. So here's my ask to make sure I can deal with the topic as honestly as possible. If you are someone who genuinely supports the highest end estimates we see for casualties or force regeneration on either side, and you believe you have some compelling evidence that supports that belief that I should review, please send it to me. In terms of other topics, there's a number that I'm working on, and patrons have recently voted in a poll on the topics they would like to see done. So what I'll probably do early this coming week is take the top results from that patron poll and put them to the regular YouTube audience for potential prioritization. As always, I can't promise that I'll follow the will of the people at all times, but I will take it into account. And finally, thank you to those of you who watched and interacted with the video on casualty care in Ukraine last week. I'm aware it's something more of a niche and potentially painful topic, but it is one I ultimately felt pretty strongly about making. And finally, as always, a great thanks to all of you who continue to engage with and support this channel. Thank you very much, and I'll see you all again next week.